we live in a society where, a monetary economy is how the world runs. So we need to have a link between these, again, intrinsic existential values that's tied to a monetary value. My hope is that we can do that. And we need to be creative. We need to be prepared to step out of the box of how we've done things forever and bring about new partnerships where there's strong alignment strategically. And I think letting the free market have a say, so to speak, if you can bring in these economic interests that are positive for forest health, then that can really be a lever. And having, the governance structures in place that are in support of that and not kind of just causing a lot of bottlenecks and friction in the system.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, I have some news. This is one of the last 4 episodes of Your Forest. It's coming to an end. It's just a natural progression of my life and my career. The podcast I do on the side, it is extra work, and it's cutting into family time. So it's time to liberate some space. And as much as I have loved and really enjoyed this adventure, and I'm so appreciative of the sponsors of Wes Fraser, of GreenLink, of so many people that helped me get to where I am, yeah, it's coming to an end. December 2025 will be the last episode, but I got some good ones planned. I'm excited. They're really good ones, and yeah. Gonna finish it off with a bang. So, with that, today's episode is one of the last 4. It is the 4th last one, in fact, and is an interesting one. So, we've been talking a lot about the idea of forest finance. The idea of trying to leverage the free market to help create more sustainable future and healthier forests. Like, how do we pay for biodiversity using the free market? How do we get the economy to care about forest health, essentially? And so, to have this conversation, I brought on somebody that talks about and thinks about and plans for exactly this. Shauna Matcovich. She is a forester and sustainability expert with over 15 years of experience in cross-continental sustainable forest management and global forest investment management. So, she spends her time thinking about, talking about, and planning out how people can do exactly this. How can they leverage free market, pay for these things to make sure that they are here forever and that our society is invested literally in these things, monetarily speaking, right? So she's the founding director of ForestLink, which is an organization started to produce the link between forest health and sustainability and finance and business, exactly like I said, right? She also has a podcast through that organization, also called the ForestLink. She breaks down all these ideas down there, has on guests, and talks to some of the world leaders in this space so we can really, really get in to understand it. And after listening to a few episodes, I'm kind of addicted to it. It's really interesting. There's so much interesting stuff going on, and definitely recommend checking that out, the ForestLink. So, sponsors for this episode, Wes Fraser is the #1 sponsor for 2025, and they have been since almost the very, very first episode. And I could not be more grateful for Wes Fraser's support over the years. They've let me do things the way I want to do them and have the stories and information that I want to have. And they just keep supporting me. I appreciate it. It's been great. It's been a real exercise in freedom of thought and information, and it's been awesome. So thank you, Wes Fraser, for that. And GreenLink Forestry, same. GreenLink has been with me since the very beginning, nothing but supportive, and I couldn't say enough amazing things about GreenLink. So thank you very much to both of you for supporting me over the years and for the last few episodes. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation with Shauna all about forest investment and how we can invest our actual money into creating more biodiversity, more forest health, and a more sustainable future. Here we go. Well, first of all, thank you, Shauna, for joining me today. I'm looking forward to diving deeper into forest investment because it's something I've touched on now and again throughout episodes, but I feel like there's a lot of times it's been this kind of cursory tiptoeing around the concept of like, yeah, we can totally do it, and I don't know how. And that's kind of been the extent of it, right? Is the excitement is there and the passion is there, and there hasn't been a ton of detail. So I'm really excited to speak with you. Through your podcast, Forest Invest, I was able to learn so much about forest investments and how they work and the potential there. And so, yeah, I wanted to have you on to really break this down for us. We'll start slow. First of all, I want to learn a little bit about you. So, yeah, tell me about your journey into forest investment. And like most importantly, I want to know why you've dedicated your professional life to forest investment.
Ooh, that's a good question. So like you, I'm originally a forester, also from Canada, from BC more specifically. And my boots on the ground experience started on the west coast of BC, working in, traditional forestry, doing cut block layout and silviculture planning and that kind of thing. Early on, decided I needed to get out and see the world a little bit more. So I did that. I worked in plantation forestry in New Zealand for a forest company there doing harvest planning. And along my travels, I was traveling through the tropics a bit and saw some of the forests there because, I love forests. So when I go and travel the world, I'm going to see forests in other parts of the world. And anyway, I was really kind of devastated with what I saw. And just trying to put the pieces together with my professional background and seeing that, generally speaking, forests in BC, forests in New Zealand are pretty well managed. There's pretty good regulations and forest management practices in place. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I can use my education and experience to improve things in these areas where forest management is clearly not going well.
Yeah.
And so with that, I kind of started exploring my options and found myself in a master's program studying tropical forestry in Europe, of all places. And but I do have to say we had some great field trips, so that was pretty great. And while I was doing my studies, I got the idea that private finance would be the way into sustainable forest management in these emerging markets because they don't have the strong regulations. Government forest management is not a thing in a lot of places, or they have the regulations, but they're just not enforced. So I was like, okay, well, if the industry is strong, then maybe that's a way to improve forest management in these areas. So that was kind of the focus. I hunted around a bit for a company that was operating in these jurisdictions that was utilizing private capital to bring about sustainable forest management and found one actually right down the road from my university and kind of knocked on their door and said, can I do my master's thesis with you? And, that found me in the Amazon jungles for 2 months living with the indigenous people there and who were working with a forest company on a concession in natural tropical forests. So that was kind of the educational piece. Later on, I got on with that company and I've been there, I guess you could say, for, I think it was about 12 years, working on a tropical forest fund where we basically manage these investments on behalf of institutional investors. And so that's what I do today. The why is, again, I see investment as a strong lever to bring about sustainable forest management in places where regulations are not doing their job. So that's the long story.
That's awesome. I'm very impressed by folks like yourself who can go to another part of the world and see a problem and just be like, oh, I could totally help solve this problem, and not just be like, wow, that sucks that's like that. I wish they would figure it out. Because that would be I would just go, that's what I would do. I'd be like, oh, I hope someone figures that out one day, right? I don't even think that I can be a part of that solution. So for someone like yourself to see that and have that connection of be like, oh, that someone could be me is awesome.
Yeah, or I could have a piece to play.
Yeah.
It's obviously, I'm sure you've heard the expression before that forestry isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that.
I'm going to piss off all the rocket scientists. I don't think they're listening though, but yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah, it is funny, right? When you start to include different cultures and you start to include like, social dynamics and all this stuff, it's not just growing trees, right? You got the balance of ecosystems and culture and people, and it's a whole nother thing. So, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for detailing that. Gives us a little insight into your perspective, where you're coming from. And I have a question regarding it, just to get this one out of the way. And so you hear, as soon as the idea of using forest investments to help, solve the world's problems, like try and increase carbon sequestration or biodiversity, or using forest investments for this idea of putting a dollar value to biodiversity or whatever it might be, people started to kind of get concerned, right? People start to go, okay, well, I don't know how I feel about putting a dollar value to something like as subjective as biodiversity, right? And people start to get worried that maybe we're still putting money as king, right? And that until we can get away from that idea, we're forever going to be prisoners to money. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can understand where people are coming from. Hey, like they're kind of saying, hey, until we have this paradigm shift where we start to appreciate things for what they are instead of comparing them to money, how are we ever going to change? So I want to know how you feel about that idea, or is it more of that the reality is our society is run on money, and if we want to start ourselves down this path of sustainability and down this path of the public understanding and appreciating forest health, that we have to make it easy for them.
Yeah, and I guess I have two perspectives on that. Of course, I'm idealistic, and I would like to say that we all intrinsically value forest health and having our forests. And, when you hear about these social science surveys on willingness to pay for XYZ service and, to try and attribute a value to different, I don't know whether you call them existential values, intrinsic values of the forest. And it's all very hypothetical to people. It's like, how much do you value your child's health?
Yeah.
Can you put a dollar value on that?
Yes.
Like, absolutely not. And not to say that your child's health is going to compare to how you value a forest, but it's very difficult to do, because in most cases it's a public good. The forests are there, whether or not they're privately owned. You get access to the benefits that they provide. So it's very hard to put a price tag on a lot of things. Of course, timber, lumber, that's one thing. That's easy. Even, non-timber forest products, that's another thing. Recreation, you can to some extent put a price tag on that. But, when you get into, the complicated topic of biodiversity, that's a huge can of worms. Carbon is, of course, getting easier because you can kind of measure it. It's the tricky part is, of course, the topic around quality and permanence, and we can that's a whole other discussion, and we can get into it if needed. But I think the best that we can do with where we are at as a society is to try and equate it to some value and find those parties who it makes sense to pay for.
Yes.
And who are willing to pay for it. And they see also the economic value in paying for it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think I know it's not a blanket case of every source of capital is suitable to every source of or type of forest investment that you can have. I mean, it's so specific, the types of objectives you're going to have.
Yes.
I mean, whether or not you're a donor or a government agency or an institutional investor or a private philanthropist, I mean, and you're going to have different objectives and you're going to need to have those met. So I think that's kind of maybe how it needs to be looked at in the midterm while we're working on, a new economic model. Yeah.
I agree. I think the reality is I would love to say that, yes, there are these intrinsic values of the forests, and it does seem to degrade them by putting a dollar value to them. However, the other option is that the rest of the world continues not to care or understand how to value it, and therefore it just disappears. And so, I definitely see it as a necessary next step. Like, it's a step in the right direction. I often talk about, in this world of advancing, innovating forest management and sustainability and inclusivity and all that stuff, we often get stopped by the fear of imperfection, right? Like, oh, it's not perfect yet. We haven't quite got there. It's not quite there yet. I don't know if we should take this next step. And then nothing happens. Nothing changes because we're afraid of making a mistake. Whereas I think we have to continue to take steps, and they're never going to be perfect. But as long as they're steps in the right direction, you know what I mean? As long as we keep trying, we can always change it. That's the whole idea, is that we can innovate, we continue to innovate. We don't need to get stuck in something.
Absolutely.
So, I think it's exciting, because all of a sudden, the world thinks about money all the time anyways. So if we can start to show people, hey, this, biodiversity is worth X number of dollars or whatever, all of a sudden people start to think about their purchases, and they start to think about their lifestyle in the terms of biodiversity or carbon sequestration or whatever, and it just starts to become part of the culture. And once it's part of the culture, then you can really start to make change. So although I understand people's fears, I think it's the tangible, practical next step is to include it in the market,
Yeah, I agree. And I also agree with the, try it out. You can always change it. And I mean, that's what management is anyway. And lucky for us, forests, they're patient, and we can take our time and pivot and change regimes if it's not working. Mm-hmm. And, I think it's also important to, depending on your role in the forest sector, whether you're, a boots on the ground manager, you're a logging company, sawmill operator, financer, investor, government agency, we're all kind of stuck in the silos that we usually operate in. It's like,
yes,
oh, we work in this kind of provincial tenure system where we have a long-term lease, and it's leased out to a logging company, and, they can harvest X amount of timber per year, and this is how we do that, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
But it's very singularly focused.
Yeah.
It's not, it works for the system it was set up to work for, but maybe it's time for a new system, or to add value to that system. And by adding value, I don't necessarily mean add more dollars that can be pumped out of that forest, but, building in these intrinsic values we were talking about. So maybe the economic value doesn't change. Maybe it stays the same. But can you get more out of that in terms of access or diverse species inclusion or improved restoration after a harvesting event or natural disturbance? It requires more thinking about it. And to that point of the investment side, thinking about who are the partners who are going to have a strategic stake in those extra values that you want to bring out of the forest.
Yes. Yeah, I'm excited at the potential here, right? Because it has the potential to really help us change the way we see forests, right? Like move away from the just seeing it for timber and seeing it for all its values, and really starting to compare how these things relate to each other. Because I think up until now, we really don't have a way to compare like a management strategy until now, really, right? Like how will this impact the ecology? How will this impact carbon sequestration? Like it gets us thinking in a totally different way, and it's so healthy, and like it's going to help us build so much more resilience, right?
Yeah.
So I really want to, I think when we talk about forest investment, in all honesty, before really diving into your podcast, I wasn't really sure what we were talking about. Like, who exactly is investing in what, where, and why, right? Like, is this something that I can go to my bank and I can go like, oh yeah, I want the forest mutual fund. That's the one. Yeah, I want that one. Or is it something that we're talking about like this is private capital, like these are companies that are paying for this to try and meet their ESG needs, or like, so can you explain kind of an overview of how forest investment works, kind of the breadth of it, so people can understand? Because I think a lot of times we skip that step. Mm-hmm. And so just understanding what that looks like, what the options are that exist out there.
Right. No, very good question. And, one that those of us are take for granted. And I hate to break it to you, but there aren't many solutions for private individuals. So if you find a forest mutual fund, let me know. So not to say there have been some schemes with,
schemes,
you can,
good word.
Yeah, where you can, buy a tree that's planted, and I don't know enough about it to speak to that. So I will leave that there. And for any listeners who are interested, I'm sure you can find some information on those retail strategies.
Yeah.
But I would say kind of where the concept began, at least how I would describe it, is with what is called timberland investment. And I try not to use that term because I again think it's very singularly focused, and I think we're moving away from that. But in the 80s, basically what happened is a lot of vertically integrated forest companies, so sawmill operations and forest lands, decided to separate their holdings. And the sawmilling companies were selling off the land because they just wanted to focus on the milling operations. And they were selling them to institutional investors. So what I mean by that are things like your pension fund. So where does your pension money go? So these big institutions who are responsible for managing, large purses of capital. Yeah. And for long terms, because forest investment, of course, it's not like you don't just buy in and sell in the next year or something like that. They're long term. So institutional investors, so again, pension funds, it could be insurance companies, some foundations, larger endowments. So those institutions who are, used to managing large amounts of capital and have diversified strategies. So usually what you would find is that a timberland investor would maybe allocate 1% of their portfolio to timberland. So it's very small. It's classified as an alternative investment, often a real asset. So you could kind of put it in the same bucket as real estate or infrastructure. And, it's got different benefits that these institutional investors like. So it's uncorrelated to other investments that they might have in their portfolio. It's a hedge against inflation. And it's got this excellent quality, which, investing into a real estate building or a highway or something doesn't have. And that's the biological growth. So as you hold your investment, it literally grows with time. So the value of that, of course, increases over time. It also has the benefit, if prices are low, you can hold your asset. You don't have to harvest, and you can wait it out. All the meanwhile, your asset, your biological asset, is growing. So these are the kind of bread and butter traditional drivers for returns in mainstream timberland investment. And, it's not going to make super high returns, but it's a stable long-term return that they like. And that's what they have it in their portfolio for.
Yes.
So that's kind of the traditional when we're talking about forest investments and, you have the main pension funds that are getting involved in it. That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
But I will kind of expand on that to say, at least in my vernacular, how it's shifting is to bring in these other umbrella benefits that are just inherently part of a forest.
Right.
And because when you talk timberland, you could have a 10,000 hectare monoculture, that's being grown for pulp, for example, that would fit into that portfolio. And of course, depending on who you talk to and what the objectives are and the management regime for that forest, biodiversity could be quite low. You might have water impacts, soil impacts, and these kinds of things. So it ultimately also depends on what your objectives are. So with that, fast forward to the Paris Agreement, where there were a lot of discussions on, reducing emissions, a lot of commitments made by countries, corporations starting to get involved in the discussion. And I would say that's kind of when the voluntary carbon market started to pick up and you started seeing more interest in what forests could do. And multifaceted, because forests are a huge source of emissions when we're talking about deforestation and wildfire, but then they're also a huge sink. So in the forest themselves and then in long-term wood products. So investors also coming to understand the climate benefits of forest. And as I would say, maybe European investors, we're a bit more of a trailblazer in looking for these sustainability objectives.
Yep.
So recently there's been some new legislation in European financial regulations that have encouraged investors to disclose on sustainability issues. So with that, now they're looking for funds and investment opportunities that tick these sustainability boxes. And, depending if you kind of operate the monoculture example that I explained, that would be lower on the sustainability side compared to, let's say, a mixed species, uneven age, biodiversity enhancement objectives are in there, maybe increased carbon stock is in there, but it's also generating timber returns as well. That might be further what they're calling like a super green or extra green, like,
sure, yeah.
bright,
you get
bright,
the point.
bright green.
Yeah.
And don't like to use the word green because, of course, it's associated with greenwashing and all the rest of it. But just to say that investors are recognizing these other values, not necessarily in monetary terms, but saying, okay, if I'm presented with one strategy that's looking at monoculture and another one that is, got all these other values tied to it. And I do have to say this really depends on the strategy and I'm oversimplifying it here.
Of course.
But, that one that has a more kind of integrated, holistic forest management approach could be more attractive to that type of investor.
That makes sense.
So it really ranges. And then you get into, like we were talking biodiversity credits, which is a very new thing. Some in this that are actually operating in that space don't like to use the term even biodiversity credit because it's like, oh, is that just like a carbon credit? Are we going down that same path that's had kind
loaded.
of numerous iterations and things like that. So, but again, where the interest comes from, you can't have the case of, oh, I'm a land manager and I see, there's huge opportunity to restore this certain habitat species. And this is a great parcel of land to do that. And I'm just going to pitch this to everybody. But it's maybe not the right approach because not everyone's going to see the value in that. You need to almost develop these kind of more boutique strategies hand in hand with the investor from the first place. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It can't just be the bleeding heart strategy kind of thing. Like, hey, this is good for the world. It has to be good for the world, but also good for my pocketbook. Like,
good for my pocketbook. Or, I mean, it's investors could, again, I use the word investor loosely, a capital provider, let's say,
Sure.
because maybe the returns that they're after is risk reduction.
Okay.
It's so I was recently at an event that was looking at EU forest restoration, and they were looking at ways to scale up these different demonstration projects that they were doing. And there was one project that they were implementing where it was highland planting of like restoration of native forests.
Okay.
And lower on the slope. So right now, those upper slopes were bare, in this landscape that we were talking about.
Yeah.
And, mid slope was monoculture plantation that was going to be harvested. And they knew that it was going to be good for soil retention and the hydrological cycle and all the rest of it. For forest health, this was the right thing to do. You're never going to harvest that. It's going to be like shrubby pine that's, it's probably not going to grow more than a meter or two tall. But it has great benefits for forest health. And they're like, but who's going to pay for this? Like, who's going to see the value in what this, shrub establishment essentially could do? And, we were also talking about the challenges that they've seen in the slopes after they've harvested. And, of course, they have road closure, like road damage, because you have a big landslide that takes up the road. You have flooding in the local community below. And I'm like, well, what about the insurance companies who's insuring those homes down below in the communities? Or what about, the road authorities who are going to have to fix those roads? I mean, you need to think, again, go out of the box and not just think about it in terms of we're doing this public good service, but really think strategically about who has the interest in supporting that risk, or in this case, a catastrophic event doesn't occur. And so it's not a financial return per se, but it's reducing the risk of a huge cost down the road.
Totally. I like that. That's a great way. That shifts the way I think about it a little bit, right? I think I was still stuck in the mindset of like, how can we make this be enticing to people, right? But you're thinking more, who is already invested but doesn't really realize it yet.
Correct.
How do we open up that conversation and see where we can go? So, okay, that's great. I really like that. That does shift the way you think about this relationship. I like that a lot. Yeah.
And I mean, and there's so many different flavors of ice cream you could have here, let's say. Like it could be a more strategic dialogue between parties that you might not think would necessarily come together on having mutual objectives kind of achieved on the same landscape, and bringing together that capital that has different objectives. And often it can be a discussion on who's flexing bigger muscles in terms of my objectives are more important than yours, or I have more capital to invest than you do, or I have the say at the end of the day on how things are managed. But I mean, I think if those two parties can come together, or 3 or 4 parties even, and have this constructive dialogue, and instead see, view it more in a solutions approach, where, of course, there's going to be times where there's going to be kind of, no, we want to manage this part of the land like this, and we want to manage it this kind of land like this. And you have to have a way to settle that. But I think more often than not, it can be a collaborative discussion where you say, look, how can our objectives actually amplify? How can my objectives amplify the chance of you meeting yours?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's finding that win-win solution, I think, is another great opportunity of working together in partnership for different objectives on the landscape.
Yeah. And that's the world we live in now, right? That's the world we live in, is where we're so integrated, or need to be so much more integrated into helping, different industries and interest groups and stakeholders need to be at the same table, because otherwise nobody's needs are being met. Right. Yeah. So like that totally makes sense, because we're seeing now the creation of so many different consortiums and networks and all this stuff to try and solve some of these collaboration issues. So like it makes sense that like why not use that opportunity also to try and solve some of these problems, right? Through investments and through collaboration and yeah, that totally makes sense. Like I think now is the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Listening to your show, you had someone on, Bettina von Hagen. Is that how you say her name?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. And she had this one phrase that she said that I found was so powerful. And it's around the discussion around how investing can support, biodiversity and these non-timber values, right? How do we support water and soil quality and habitat and all this type of stuff? And she said, forests have an incredible production of public services, from climate function to soil to carbon to water to habitat, and so much of that is not captured in the financial benefits of conventional timber management. So aligning those is just so critical. And when she said that, it kind of like the way she worded that, like conventional timber management, and it really opened up my mind into how we can start to think about these types of things, right? And so I realized that this is kind of an emerging part of it, right? Like we're right now, it's a lot of the investments, it sounds like through listening to your podcast, is about like timber management or carbon management, and you might have some of these other investments like you're talking about, like maybe fire risk or something. But do you see, because you're kind of at the top of that pyramid, seeing all the different strategies and everything that's going on, do you think it's possible? Do you think this can work, that we can have, we can have our timber and our biodiversity too on these private lands? Like this is something that you're seeing enough interest, you're seeing enough investment that like we can actually accomplish this? Or is it just too, because it seems so complicated?
Yeah. I mean, it's good. So from the investor's perspective, it's often they hire a manager. So like Bettina's organization, or there's other what are called TIMOs, or Timberland Investment Management Organizations, that often sit in between the investor and the manager on the ground.
Okay.
That's a common setup.
Okay.
And the investor often doesn't have the know-how. They don't understand necessarily how a forest is managed and how it operates, and how these forest values interplay. What happens to the soil and water when you harvest, or the cultural benefits that a forest provides to a local indigenous group, or what have you, or a salmon run in a nearby fish stream in the case of where Bettina's operating. So they rely on the TIMO to translate their objectives to the manager on the ground. Okay. And work vice versa. They often have a good understanding of how the forests are managed. Now,
the facilitator,
exactly. And it's also, and I mean, to some extent, I operate in that way too. I mean, it's really like a translation between the parties. You have to translate investor needs to those on the ground, and you have to translate the realities of operating, managing a forest to the investors to say what's possible and what have you. So that said, in order to kind of have these concrete benefits, like let's say soil improvement, or
let's call it forest health. Let's say forest health.
Forest health. Go with that. So let's say forest health. Now, what needs to happen, unfortunately, is this needs to be broken down, at least how I would see it. It needs to be an objective, so an impact. I like to kind of work in a theory of change. Say your objective is you want to enhance forest health. That's long term. So what are going to be your outcomes, maybe in the midterm, to show that you're moving in that direction? So maybe it could be a return of large fauna or something like that to an area where you're not seeing it anymore. I'm just speaking in an example. So maybe there's a
Let's call it caribou. Let's say caribou. Caribou haven't been there in a while. Yeah.
Okay. So we want to see if we see an increase of caribou in this certain forest landscape where they were before, but maybe they've dropped off in number. That's going to show us that maybe there are keystone species that are showing that we're improving forest health in this area.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring it down even further to the near term. What are going to be our operational indicators, our KPIs now that are going to be a direct result of the activities that we do, of our output? I don't know. Speak to something in caribou habitat that you're going to see happen quickly. Is it like
caribou habitat? Generally, they're in fens, right? They spend a lot of time in fens and in the adjacent pine stands. So maybe you're staying away from those medium to old growth pine stands on the edge of the fen or something like that. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Or restoring some of these that maybe have been degraded through harvesting activities or something like that.
Or it was burnt, right? It was
burnt or
something.
Needs rewetting. I don't know. So then your output could be number of hectares of whatever intervention it is that you've done to restore this habitat.
There you go.
And so your activity is going to be doing these actions. So it's going to be maybe you move your harvest away and focus it in other areas. Going to be replanting of XYZ species to encourage this pine setup that you're looking for, and whatever these activities are going to be that are going to enhance the output. And then your input is going to be the money that you need to do this. It's going to be the other resources you're going to need. Maybe you need to hire a game biologist. I don't know, to
expertise.
To help you.
Yep.
Exactly. And so basically you put this kind of impact pathway together to see over the long term what needs to happen, and how are you going to know if you're kind of getting there. Okay. And now this is a long way of going about saying this, but where the investor is going to come in and what they need to know is what I would suggest is putting your financial investment pathway in there alongside it. So you can see how you can meet both your financial objectives and your impact objectives at the same time. So with this, you're still going to have your, let's say, commercial timber strategy. So you're going to kind of say how much you're going to invest into what's going to generate your timber returns, and then what activities you're going to do for that. So you're going to be, let's say, harvesting mature timber from XYZ area, which might be a change from what it was before. Maybe you make the strength for the resilience building of adding these. Maybe it's going to reduce wildfire from the traditional strategy, which is a risk, of course, to the investor. So you want to collect data on that, and on through the impact pathway for your financial objectives as well. And what you need to do is be able to collect the data that is important to the investor. And this is why I think a lot of impact is just intrinsic and taken for granted. And going back to Bettina's point, where she said, there isn't really a way to capture that value, is because the data until now is seen as nice to have. It's not seen as need to have. It's having that information is not necessarily going to tell me how many cubic meters of wood I can harvest and what the timber price is, and therefore what my return on investment is going to be. But if you can link your financial and impact objectives so that they are dependent on one another in some ways. It's not this is perfect world speaking. Of course, it's not always going to be like this. But if you can do that, then you can also show to the investor that this is important. So I think really the important part is helping the investor to understand what's important to them and why they need to care about soil, for example. Choosing metrics that are not going to break the bank to measure, because that's another thing. I mean, with nature data, biodiversity data, I mean, you can measure whatever you want, but it's going to cost you a lot of money and it's going to take you a lot of time. Not in all cases, but I'm just saying you don't have to make things overly complicated. You can pick the low-hanging fruit. Just choose the right indicators and choose a well-recognized methodology based on science for collecting data and measure your results over time. And then you can tell, how one affects the other. If these soil improvement activities are actually improving your timber outcomes, maybe not. Maybe they don't have anything to do with your final harvest volumes or, your restoration capacity of the forest. But maybe it's not hurting either. Maybe you're getting strong benefits to soil and water without harming the harvesting. So you realize it's absolutely a value-added management regime to follow, whatever that might be.
No, that totally makes sense, because I think I was imagining this idea of like the biodiversity credit thing, right? Like, oh, we have a carbon market and we know how to measure carbon and how to invest in carbon and what it's worth and how to delay to get more carbon in the ground before we harvest. And the carbon thing, we're kind of figuring it out, right? And so I was imagining, okay, a biodiversity thing, the same kind of way, and there would be this, but the way you're describing it is it's this much more integrated, nuanced, and particular approach to that is specific to every area, which I think is so much more robust and realistic, right? Because we're talking about, okay, what specifically do you want to do in this area? How can we make this happen, right?
Yeah.
So I think that helps a lot, because like I said, I was just imagining this like biodiversity market where I'm buying biodiversity and we're going to go out and create more biodiversity somehow or whatever, right? So I like this idea of it being much more nuanced and being more integrated into the locality and really so as long as we can monitor in a reasonable way, we can find ways to incentivize paying for these types of strategies. I like that. That's good.
And maybe to add to that, I mean, there's a couple of things building on what you just kind of fed back to me is incentivization to pay for it. Again, I would speak to, it might not be your traditional timberland investor, that's interested in that. If it doesn't cost a lot of money to change the management regime, it's not going to be a problem. You could probably just roll it out in your regular strategy. If you are going to need additional capital to do those interventions for the biodiversity outcomes, then you might need to find additional capital that has that interest. So let's say in the tropics where there's a huge discussion on deforestation in commodity supply chains. So like soy production or coffee, cocoa, even timber to some extent. So let's say these big agricultural conglomerates that are producing soy, they don't want to be associated with deforestation. And so maybe they have an interest in biodiversity for retaining intact, vulnerable forest landscapes.
Okay.
Because that's going to eventually give them a bad reputation if they're associated with clearing that. On the other hand, maybe it is pollination of your crop that you're worried about. So again, maybe you have coffee in your supply chain. It's maybe a big part of what you do. And pollination is really important. So of course you need a certain biodiversity to ensure that those pollinators are coming and pollinating the coffee. And so they have a reason to want to enhance biodiversity in these forest landscapes rather than having them kind of maintain the monoculture structure, for example. So this could be a partnership effort,
right?
Where I don't know how coffee is pollinated. Like I'll just put that aside. But what I'm meaning to say is to find that strategic interest where there is a literal willingness to pay when that is what's needed, when you do need that extra capital.
Okay, that's great. I like this. So it sounds like a lot of, from what I've been hearing, is a lot of the forest investment strategies that are coming out. A lot of it is for private land. Is that correct? Is that the main gig right now?
Until now, I would say yes. That's still the most preferred way because it's the lowest risk.
Of course.
It's perceived as the lowest risk, should I say. Okay. And I mean, because there's also this, and it's not a simple question.
Yeah.
But I mean, you are essentially owning the land as the investor,
Yes.
so that's just equate it to your home. You have, as a homeowner versus a renter. As a renter, you could be kicked out of your house from one day to the next, and the rules could change on your rights in that house. And it's the same with forest land.
Okay.
So
my thought, because like a forester in Alberta, right? Like all of our lands, or most of the forest management lands, are public lands, right?
Yeah.
And I've always been thinking about this idea of how we can incentivize forest management companies to make slightly different decisions based off, maybe enhancing habitat, or maybe foregoing a harvest of one specific spot to help with caribou habitat, or maybe a cultural rights, or whatever it might be, right? But how do we? So we want them to manage slightly differently and try to be a little bit more sensitive to some of this stuff, but it also is a direct cost to them, right, to do that differently. So it's just like we're asking them to do something out of the kindness of their heart, but at the end of the day, they're a business, and the business is going to do what the business has to do, right? And so how do we create incentivizations markets for public forest manager companies to actually make different decisions, right? How do we make it easy for them to make the biodiversity decision when you know that those foresters would like to make that decision, but they can't, because that will cost them their job and their livelihood. So it's like, so my thought was always this: how do we start to incentivize or create financial incentives for publicly managed forests to do it differently, right? So they can actually justify it. Yep. And so with the intention of that being to create more resilient, healthier forests over time, right? More sustainability. We have sustainable forest management, but we want to keep amping it up, keep making it better, more resilient, and better over time, right? So where are we with that idea? Because I feel like it hasn't really been. I haven't heard much about it. So like, is that something that you can imagine coming on board at some point, or are we still a long ways off?
Yeah, so excellent question. And to me remains a huge conundrum with Canadian forestry in general, because obviously there's a huge opportunity that is untapped until now. I say that most traditional forest investment takes place on private land. That doesn't mean it exclusively takes place on private land. So there are often in a lot of emerging markets, and of course you can't compare the Canadian forest industry to, an emerging market where, there's no formal timber measurement system or species classification or what have you. But there are still investors who are investing into long-term lease setups. Okay. So this might be a 49-year lease. This might be a 99-year lease on the land. So it is taking place. So it is possible. I would say tenure security is still of the utmost importance. So, a question back to you: how secure can an investor be that, this eventual tenure that they're going to invest into, so say via this forest company that has the tenure, that's going to change? Is that land going to end up in the hands of somebody else?
Right.
What's the risk of that?
Yeah, it's a good point, because it's up until now, I feel like we've been fairly secure in our public land forests, but I mean, Alberta specifically, there's been pushes in the other direction, right, to try and privatize stuff. And in the States, right, like in the States, obviously they're trying to sell off public land like crazy. So yeah, I could see that. I could see that. So that's the big challenge that stops this from moving forward, you think?
That's the big challenge, because forest investment is long term, and you need absolutely, like, I would almost say the first risk that they would consider is, I don't want to say the first, but let's say it's in like the top 5, is land security.
Okay.
If there's no freehold land ownership, it's how secure is that, whatever the tenure rights are, that lease agreement, that concession. I guess an easier example would be just to kind of paint the picture. So I see a huge opportunity in BC, at least, for extra value added, improved biodiversity, improved fire management, cultural awareness, and bringing in of cultural values into forest management is, managing understory and forest waste for bioenergy.
Sure. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So depending on where you are, I'm not saying it's a silver bullet and a blanket approach you can use everywhere. But, this has anyone listening and you want to talk about this, I'd love to talk to you about it. But no, the opportunity for investment into management practices that will, let's say, have this value-added project or product going into waste reduction, fuel reduction, improved integration of cultural heritage in terms of fire management on the forest landscape. You're having win-win-win-win-win, and especially if we're talking about the nation's, reconciliation and getting back access to land and land rights. It's building strength in the access to these rights of the different nations if we're operating in their traditional territories. So I could absolutely see an investment case for this product because there's a clear return. And if done in the right way, obviously you're going to have biodiversity enhancement as well. And again, we go back to choosing the right metrics that you're going to measure to be able to show that that biodiversity enhancement has actually taken place. And maybe your impacts are also fire reduction. Of course, that's a tricky one to measure because you can't say, a fire was absolutely going to happen here if we didn't relieve that fire load or fuel load. But anyway, that's a case for another day. But I mean, I think where you can really aim to reduce the risk, if you have public tenure, you want to have where everyone's best interests are to not change the tenure.
Right.
System.
Okay.
You want that tenure security, and you need to reduce the risks around losing that tenure security in order to make it attractive for investment.
Okay. That makes sense. So that's where we gotta work on. Because if we want to make it easy for forest companies to make different decisions, then we're gonna have to figure this out, right?
And it could be shorter term looking, like I said, with the waste for bioenergy, for example. That's an investment where they would see a clear return on investment.
Right.
So thinking about where is there a clear return on investment, whether you're talking to, or maybe it's, public works authorities are willing to put in some money to stop erosion or, flood relief or prevention, these kinds of things. Again, looking for those kind of out of the box alternative sources of capital where those authorities, you're going to be saving them from risks from eventuating.
Yes. No, that totally makes sense. Yeah, it's such a troublesome problem, right? Because we want to try and find these ways to make it easy to make different decisions, and it's all so integrated. But it seems like it's doable. It's just a matter of thinking outside the box a little bit, right? So I really liked your example of figuring out ways to create investments into Indigenous cultural values and that kind of thing, right? Can you expand on those ideas a little bit more? Because that was one of my questions, was how can we create markets for or opportunities for Indigenous leadership and stewardship in forest management, because a lot of those are public lands as well, right? They're technically right. Even in their traditional area, they're still held under the crown. So what does that look like? Is that something that's coming around too? You had a good example there. I'm wondering what else exists.
Well, I think there is. So going back to Bettina, I don't want to kind of write in stone that this is happening, but I believe they're doing some interesting work with Indigenous groups in the Pacific Northwest in Washington, Oregon region for that. But of course, it's still privately held land. So again, that's different.
Right. Okay.
Now, in the Canadian context, where, and again, I have to preface this where your listeners probably know a lot more about this than I do, just because I've been out of the area for so long, but I
Sure.
do have a high level understanding of how things are changing. But, I do understand that now forest management decisions and land use decisions in general, there's a big conversation that's happening between the government and the nations, right? So it's not like a one and done thing if there's going to be changes. So one strategy, and again, I hope I'm not being too idealistic, appreciating that there's a lot of different opinions on how things are managed, but it could be that a nation presents this strategy themselves, or a collaboration between different nations if there are different groups that work together, where they have rights or are in the process of getting rights to land, to the tenure, and how that is set up with the government, of course, needs to be discussed.
Yeah.
But with that, forest investments are often held, not always, but often held in closed-end funds.
Okay.
So this could be a 10-year fund, and that fund has a certain strategy. So all those investors are agreeing to that strategy. We want this much return over 10 years, 15 years, whatever it might be. This is, the types of geographies we're going to invest in. These are the management regime. And speaking to what we're talking about, these are the impact objectives we're looking for. We want fire reduction. Maybe it's got a strong cultural, social, indigenous element to it. So we want, indigenous leadership over the strategy. We want to make use of local contractors, whatever it could be. This is kind of all in the bucket of this strategy. And the investors all go, oh, yeah, I like it. I'm going to invest X amount into this strategy. And then it's executed by, in this case, it could be the nation or the consortium of nations. So they hold the land. They take care of all the contracting, preparing the management plans, doing the harvesting and sales and what have you. And they've raised capital from these private investors. And then, this is where it would get a bit complicated, because a fund strategy, you eventually liquidate and sell those assets to other investors. A lot of forest investment strategies work that way. But it would be, it would be set up differently. So you could think about what would happen to those assets after. Maybe the nations buy them back in their entirety, so maybe it's in a way kind of they get the upfront capital for doing all the work, basically. And they pay back the investors themselves to hold. And this, again, is where it's important, the discussion with the government and that 10-year security. So this let's say this indigenous collaboration having continued access to those lease rights on a continual basis.
Yes.
So that is one kind of very oversimplified structure that I've kind of just rattled off. Of course, it's
that's great. That's great. It makes sense because I think what I'm understanding here is that there are a lot of options, and it's just that anybody that wants to get involved, any organization or anyone that's looking for funding, they just have to reach out to someone like yourself and start these discussions and start to explore the opportunities in their area. What are they trying to accomplish? How can we monitor that? How can we find investors that are interested in that? And it sounds like there's a lot of options for these types of stuff. It's so specific to the area that you really just need somebody in there to guide you through this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And I mean, it's, going back to that strategic partnership idea, if you have an insurance company who, let's look at, Lytton a few years ago, the whole community burnt to the ground. If the insurance companies behind that were investing into a structure that had a management strategy that was going to reduce the spread of wild. I'm not saying this that it wouldn't have happened.
Totally. Of course.
But
it helps. Resilience.
There's an interest. There's a real interest there. And there's an education piece, because of course, when you're talking about forest investment and a new strategy that these new fund managers are often presenting to investors, there's always an education piece. That it's, how is this different than from what Joe or Bob or Sally is presenting to us?
Right.
How is yours different? And maybe it doesn't need to be different, but what's going to make them want to invest into your strategy versus something else? And often it does have a lot to do with the details that really kind of align with that investor's needs.
Yes.
And so I think there is a huge opportunity there, even in the context of public land scenario. Yeah.
It's very specific to your locality and all that kind of stuff. And like, I'm just imagining, I'm optimistically imagining this, okay, we've put a dollar value on biodiversity, and this is how we monitor it. And you can go into your, into your Quest trade, and you can pay for biodiversity, and someone out there will deal with it for you, right? And I was like, yeah, someone's figured this out. And so we're not quite there yet, but where we are at is at a place where like full integration into bring in someone like yourself and someone that can help you understand the options here, and there's a lot of opportunities to find funding and manage differently and to do some cool stuff. It's just that you need somebody to guide you through it, because it sounds like there's so much integration there.
There is, and it's really exciting, I would say.
Totally.
Maybe one example I would point the listeners to, and I've had Alexandra Homeland on my podcast as well, and so just to kind of hit home the concept of this locality, being local and having local interests that have a vested interest in the biodiversity outcomes. So she's developed, through her PhD work, a biodiversity crediting system in Sweden for productive forests. So again, private land, but it's, let's say, a relatively straightforward system of, it's protection, like conservation, so pure protection of biodiversity values. It's enhancement, so it's restoring nature to a site that was maybe more monoculture, pure production, management focus. And then integrated forest management. So where you have on the same parcel of land, production activities and also restoration conservation activities. Now, she's found through this work, they found a local investor. It was a Swedish bank that had an interest, and they were in it for the journey of learning about how this could be done. And they agreed to buy the credits produced from this project. So she found a local forest owner who was interested in piloting this with her. So, his opportunity cost was not harvesting on these lands where they were going to be managing for biodiversity credits. So it had to be interesting for him to earn more or less the same of what he would have got otherwise from harvesting these stands, as he would have done business as usual.
Yeah.
And so anyway, they've had this set up to develop the system. And then I believe she was speaking to another example in Sweden where they found another buyer that was the municipality, and the municipality was interested in increasing the biodiversity in a forest to make it more interesting for the local population who use the trails for hiking and recreation purposes. Maybe it's like mushroom collecting or what have you. So they had a strong interest because their beneficiaries cared about having a more rich biodiverse forest. So again, just another real concrete example of where, the local investor really has a reason to be funding that project.
Yes, that totally makes sense. That goes back to the idea of like that should be the government's responsibility to protect the public value, right? But that's another can of worms. We won't get into that. But I find this really interesting. So I do think there was something else you were talking about during your podcast was the idea of impact investing, and that there's these different there's these investors that are really interested in the impact. They're less, it's less of the classic investing where they're looking for a return on investment directly for themselves. So that idea of impact investing, is that just like philanthropists and stuff like that who are looking to, they have money and they're looking to make a change in the world for future generations, and they're not necessarily looking for something back, or what is that concept? Because obviously, philanthropy is one way where, you can get things paid for and help increase. But I mean, ultimately, if you want it to keep going forever, if you can build it into a business strategy, I think that's a little bit more long term, right? If you can make the business case, it's easier to justify, right, to everybody. So, you explain that idea of impact investing and how that's playing a role in forest investment?
Yeah, very good question. And I mean, the short answer is impact investing is a spectrum.
Okay.
So I like the definition by the association called the GIN, so Global Impact Investing Network.
Okay.
And funny enough, they have investment partners that are called Tonic, but that's another discussion. But anyway, how they define impact investing is investing for measurable impact alongside financial returns. I mean,
both.
I'm paraphrasing it, but that's, at the end of the day, that's kind of what it means. Okay. And again, it's a spectrum. So on the one end, you could have philanthropy. On the other end, you have your kind of mainstream traditional investment that is looking for a side of impact.
Yeah.
It could be another strategy where it is purely a financial investment, but they're only going to invest into green strategies, social strategies. So maybe you're only doing social housing or something like that. But it's a theme, so they want to have their financial returns and it's strong, and they're kind of meeting their impact criteria by investing into a theme that is impactful.
Right. Okay.
So with forestry, again, there's different opportunities along the spectrum. Right. So we speak to philanthropy. How I like to see philanthropy, it's an important piece of the puzzle. But like you say, it can be kind of short term. And what philanthropy can do is be a lever to attract bigger capital to make a bigger change, Okay. And so impact investing can be all these things. And I think it's important that we understand that there are different ways to achieve impact. Let's say you're a private landowner and you have a strategy where you're going to change the management regime to a mixed age class structure, mixed species from a plantation or what have you. And maybe at the beginning, it's going to cost a bit more money. Okay. Sure. So you've got to change, instead of like clear cut what the original plan was for that land, maybe you can only take out 30% of the wood. And so maybe this, high impact investor could come in and say, we're going to reduce the impact of that loss. They come in and take the loss so that first investor is not hit, or that private investor doesn't feel the hit as badly. And it's still an interesting prospect for them. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally. That's the type of stuff that I'm thinking of. So it almost seems like private companies like the mills and stuff like that have to have their own person, their own team looking for these investment opportunities, looking for somebody to help pay for this adjusted management strategy somehow. Like that might be the way that we can start to incentivize some type of paradigm shift in how we manage forests.
Absolutely. So what it would look like is, the company that has this idea in mind, they have this strategy of how they want to change things. Somehow bring in the maybe they hire someone, maybe they go somewhere, maybe they talk to a few investors. But anyway, they kind of build up this understanding of how this can be broken down. Yeah. How you can break down the opportunity. And who are the best types of investors to bring in at certain times. And then, of course, you have to negotiate your terms of agreement. Mm-hmm. How are you going to, for the more impact-sided capital where that money is not going to generate a return, but they want the impact. And this is especially tricky in long-term impacts. Maybe they're not going to be realized in the time frame that capital is being put to work. So instead, you could look at what milestones can we achieve in the near term to show that we're on the right path, so to speak. And that next phase investor says, okay, once these milestones are achieved, A, B, and C, then we'll come in. Not before that. If you don't achieve those milestones, then we're out. The deal's broken, kind of thing.
Right.
So there absolutely is a way. And
okay, that's cool.
Yeah, and I mean, just to the point of philanthropy again, just side note is, and I would really encourage, if there's any donors listening, to think twice about the tree planting model. This approach, which seems to be quite attractive, and because for the general public in their marketing, it's like, oh, if you buy this, we're going to plant X number of trees, or these types of strategies. Because, I mean, you're a forester, a planted tree doesn't mean a adult tree,
right?
And the forest management is costly. It depends, of course, on the strategy, but planting a tree is just the beginning of the story,
Yes,
and
totally.
if you're a philanthropist and you have a limited amount of capital that you can invest, you could have so much more scale and impact if you think about it in this spectrum approach. And how can you come in to de-risk something that could potentially have a way bigger impact than your 50,000 trees ever would?
Yes. How do you continue to make an impact, not just this one-time impact, but how does that money continue to change? And continue to help society. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I like that. If I was to ask you, might be an unfair question, but I'll ask you anyways. It's a simple one. It's just I'm trying to get trying to imagine like taking the temperature of the investments that are out there, right? Like where are we at in terms of societal change? Is most of the forest investment, is it still like, hey, I see this as a good opportunity to have some safe investments, right? Something that I can depend on. I know it's safe and it's good, versus, hey, I see this as an opportunity to have like good investments, but also make a real impact in, sequestering more carbon or that kind of thing. So I'm just kind of curious to get you to give us an idea for the type of investors that you're seeing out there and where we are in that spectrum. If we're starting to see people really want to actually invest for both reasons, or if it's still mostly just like, hey, I like the idea of having safe investments.
Yep. Good question. I mean, to dodge the bullet, I would say both. But I will elaborate. So I don't see any like plain vanilla pure timberland strategies coming to the table anymore. I would say kind of what is a concern is it just window dressing what these managers are promoting? So are they taking the intrinsically green nature of a forest investment and making it seem more than what their strategy would have been in business as usual days?
I would argue that drinking the Kool-Aid for whatever reason will eventually make the Kool-Aid seem normal to everybody, right? So I think it's regardless of their motivations, whether it's just a checkbox for their ESG numbers or if it's actually motivated by the desire for change, I think the investment doesn't change. It's the same money going towards the same thing, and I think over time that becomes, even if you're just talking about the ESG, it changes the culture within the company or the organization, and you start to see. So I think it's all movement in the right direction, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, new investors to the asset class, I would say, are coming for more than timber. Whereas if you were to look, 30 years ago, it was only the timber profile that they were interested in, and these kind of return drivers that I mentioned before. I will say that, those who are in timberland and have been for several years, they still want what timberland delivers.
Right.
for them and some of the more kind of conventional investors, especially in some jurisdictions where ESG is almost like a swear word and you don't want to use it. Seriously, it's becoming quite a loaded discussion. But yeah, some investors, those that are already interested, might not care so much about the sustainability objectives. But I would say new investors do.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's good to know. So we are starting to see a kind of a societal shift, we'll say, into like being aware at least of the global impact of your investments. And I mean, that's the whole idea of the investment market in the first place, was that you would invest in the things you believe in. But now it's just turned to, I invest in the things that make money. And so like now we're trying, I feel like we're going full circle again. We're coming back to, okay, let's invest in the things that make us money. Yes. But also you should believe in it and think that it's good for society. So it's great.
And I think regulations are helping in that regard. I mean, I don't see it in North America yet, but I mean, in Europe, where you need to disclose on your sustainability, are you causing harm? Through the funds that you're investing into, you have to disclose on these things. And for a lot of these institutional investors, it makes it much easier for them to say, okay, well, let's have a whole net zero strategy. So we're going to have a portfolio of assets. Maybe it's outside of, real assets or stocks and bonds, or who knows, however they structure their portfolio. But maybe it's where this particular strategy is only going to invest into a portfolio that is net zero in terms of emissions,
Right.
So, then, these different forest investment strategies that are promoting that and can show measurable results would lock in quite easily to that. Whereas if you're a manager that is, for lack of a better word, and at the risk of sounding impolite, kind of stuck 30 years in the past, just kind of carrying on with
business dinosaurs, it's okay.
Yeah. Then, that's going to be an easy no for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like we're going to be able to stack these things too, right? Like it's not just managing for timber, but it's managing for timber, managing for carbon, managing for biodiversity, for water quality. Like these things are all, they can help each other out, right? So that's the opportunity that I think is exciting and interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you how long till you thought these types of investments would start to have an impact on public lands, but I feel like I won't ask you that question, only because it's like, it's such an unknown, right? It sounds like there's still a lot of questions to work out there, but I will ask you instead, how do you imagine in like 30 years, 50 years, take your timeline, that our relationship to forests and forest management and stewardship will have changed as a result of forest investment in these type of markets? How will our relationship change? How will the management itself change? How do you hope? Let's go with that. Let's go with, how do you hope it will change? What's your... Yeah.
I mean, I think the benefit of having an industry that supports a private investment model is more efficient. It's a more fair economic model, I guess you could say. And it depends. So it can be done, just speaking to the example in Canada with the public land situation. If the way that the tenure is managed and stewardship is structured, if that can change on its own without private investment to somehow build in value for these things, who knows whether that's like a stumpage reduction or however it's kind of built in as an incentive. It doesn't have to come from private investment, I don't think. But again, we live in a society where, a monetary economy is how the world runs.
Absolutely.
So we need to have a link between these, again, intrinsic existential values that's tied to a monetary value. My hope is that we can do that. And we need to be creative. We need to be prepared to step out of the box of how we've done things forever.
Yes.
And
not be afraid. Yeah.
bring about new partnerships where there's strong alignment strategically.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, again, I've been around during land reform in BC. And although it's supposed to be consultative, it does come across as being very top down. And I think letting the free market have a say, so to speak, if you can bring in these economic interests that are positive for forest health, then that can really be a lever. And having, the governance structures in place that are in support of that and not kind of just causing a lot of bottlenecks and friction in the system.
Oh no, red tape. Yeah. Yeah, totally. For sure. No, that makes sense. I see this as such a huge opportunity, right? Because like it's the timber management's responsibility to manage for timber. And I think that's their responsibility. They do their job. And now we need to start to bring in these other, so there needs to be other people, right? The biologists for the fish and the insects and the whatever, the hydrologists for the water, indigenous communities for their local values and all that kind of thing. And once those things are integrated, once these decisions can be integrated, and investment provides such a great opportunity to link these things, right? We start to link them together and start to create those cohesive decisions, right? They're collaborative. I think this is a real solution to how we can start to view the forest differently as a whole, rather than its segmented parts.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Which is kind of how we see it now. Like everyone's responsible for their own lane, but how do we start to bring it all together? And I think this investment idea is a great one, because it speaks in dollars. Everyone can compare, and you can relate to that, and you can start to incentivize and change the way people think. And so I think, this conversation has been really, really helpful in helping me to understand, because I think up until now it's been sort of hazy as to how this all works, and you've very, very much made it much more clear to me, at least to the mechanisms of investment and the motivations of investment and the potential opportunities that are there. So, I want to thank you for all that. That was fantastic. And just like one kind of final thing to wrap things up. And I know on your show, you seem hesitant to give advice, which I get, because it's obviously, and you've caveated every answer with, well, it depends, and this is a specific situation, and so I understand it. That's great. But just generally speaking, because we spent all this time talking about managing public land, right? What advice or what information would you offer up to people that want to learn more about this type of stuff? Public land managers that want to start going down this path and seeing what options are available to them. Because you said there's nothing really available for individuals at this point, but if we start to talk about options for forest managers, what exists and what can they do to try and seek that out?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would sit with your challenge that you're struggling with as a land manager, where you also see opportunity, right? So whatever that might be as a manager, looking to, let's say, go beyond timber.
Sure.
Think about, your challenges, your opportunities. And then I would start to think about who are your stakeholders, like who would have a vested interest in seeing this change.
Right.
And why,
Right.
And it should be a combination of capital providers, like who has a financial interest in this. Again, not necessarily just for financial returns. It could be a risk reduction or some other cost that you're going to help them produce. Maybe you're going to make things more efficient, whatever the kind of concrete benefit is. So think about that in terms of those that have capital. Also think in terms of implementing stakeholders. So who are you going to need to help make this a reality on the ground? Think about consultation. Who are you going to affect with this change? Kind of start to put the pieces together of what the actual implementation looks like, who's it going to affect, what kind of capital is going to be needed, what's the long-term objective, and start to put these pieces together, I would say.
I like that.
And then, I think you could go a long way with the discussions and building up a partnership. I think that's probably, let everyone stick to their lane and what they're good at doing. Like you said, if you're a timber manager, maybe you don't need to go and build wildlife corridors, but who can do that for you? And, shoot me an email if you have a question. I'm happy to enter a discussion. But it's not easy if you're not used to, getting involved with, partnership development and structuring investment and who would you want to go to and that kind of thing. It's definitely something new. And it's, taken me nearly 20 years to get there. So
it is clear to me that there is a need for a facilitator of change, right? Like you need someone that understands these concepts and can start to guide you down that path, because trying to do it on your own, I can imagine, would just be it'd be challenging to say the least. So,
and it's not to say that it's absolutely by no means just me. There are absolutely, I would say, timberland investment management organizations are an excellent resource, because I would say that there are some operating on private land in Canada, so they would definitely understand the nuances of the geography. But even the ones, operating just in the Pacific Northwest or even in the Northeast, understand investment structuring, what investors are looking for, these kinds of things.
Very cool. Awesome, Shauna. This was, I don't know if you have anything final that you wanted to add to this, but this is very, very eye-opening for me, and it really helped clarify things. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you. No, yes. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity and nothing else to add.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure everyone, I'll put the link of your podcast in the show notes there, and to your website, the ForestLink, of course, for people that want to reach out. And definitely going to let people know that they need to listen to your podcast, because I'm learning tons about the different opportunities and options that are out there for the, I don't know, infinite number of values that exist on the forest landscape, right? So, definitely check it out. And thanks again for your time.
No problem, and thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I hoped you got something out of that. I hoped you learned something. I know I definitely did. And I can't wait to see where this goes in the future. I feel like there's so much opportunity here, and it's just so exciting. So thank you, Shauna, for your time, for your expertise, for the podcast, the ForestLink. Check that out. Rate and review it, all that stuff. It's amazing. So good. Definitely worth a listen. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I will catch you all on the third last episode. Take care.